Hey there and welcome back to another Dreamworks video. And today, once again, I find myself talking about yet another film in the Dreamworks library that I honestly think doesn't get the recognition it deserves. It's truly underrated in every single way, whether you look at it from a critical or a commercial perspective, and indeed, it's only found a second life since the rise of the internet and meme culture, which has catapulted it into the position of cult classic. And of course, that film is The Road to El Dorado. The Road to El Dorado, released in 2000, is one of DreamWorks' few ventures into 2D traditional animation, and tells the story of Miguel and Tulio, two con artists from Spain who managed to steal a map to the legendary city of El Dorado before being imprisoned by the villainous Cortez, who also seeks the City of Gold and is embarking on an expedition to the Americas to try and find it. Of course, this means that our two heroes are along for the ride, until they escape the ship alongside Cortez's horse Altivo, and find themselves adrift at sea, until they conveniently strike land in the exact location they need to be to find the legendary city. And thus, using their map, they're able to eventually make contact with some locals who in turn lead them to the city, where they're proclaimed as gods come to Earth by the local priest. Initially excited by this prospect, the two craft a plan to load up on as much gold as they can before leaving, with the help of a local woman named Chell, with whom Tulio becomes romantically involved. However, they begin to hit a number of snags along the way. The High Priest is a total psycho who keeps trying to sacrifice people to them every chance he gets, and eventually realizes they're imposters and tries to murder them alongside everybody else in the city. The Spanish invaders are getting closer and closer, and Tulio is dedicated to leaving, whilst Miguel's fallen in love with the city and wants to remain for the rest of his life. And so, after defeating the High Priest for the first time, the pair realize that he's going to lead the Spanish to the city to loot it and massacre and enslave the people. And so, they're in turn forced to leave, destroying the only entrance to the city so it can remain a secret from the invaders forever, whilst the High Priest gets enslaved himself, which is a bit of a harsh fate, but you know what, sucked in mate, you tried to annihilate your own people. Anyway, in my eyes, it's a pretty decent plot all things considered. And this was simply one facet of what made a pretty standout film that I loved as a kid, and honestly I still love as an adult. And I mean, that's not even all. There are so many aspects of the film that really do fire on all cylinders. And we'll start off with the characters and their arcs. For the most part, they're quite well done and richly detailed. Miguel and Tulio start off the film as anti-hero protagonists. They're selfish and conceited, thieves, con artists, liars. They're only out for themselves and just want to get rich. And this pattern of behaviour continues even after they reach the fabled City of Gold. They trick the people into accepting them as their gods. They try to load up on as much gold as they can in order to ensure they live rich and luxurious lives when they return to Spain. But then the longer they stay there, the more they begin to change. Miguel becomes far more selfless, no longer really caring about obtaining wealth and glory, and wanting to stay and live out his life amongst the people that have accepted him, because he's found some sort of inner peace. Meanwhile, Tulio does become less selfish, but it takes longer to manifest. He gets a girlfriend, he argues with Miguel, and he decides to leave El Dorado with a shit ton of gold, until the city's at risk of invasion, and then he's forced to sacrifice that fortune to protect them, earning his own redemption along the way. And they are pretty good arcs, all things considered, and they complement each other perfectly, whilst also being quite different from one another. And honestly, on that note, their character dynamic throughout the entire film is one of the big elements that holds the film together and makes it worth watching. Their banter, their one-liners, their brotherhood. It all flows so seamlessly, whether it's in a comedic or a dramatic scene, and ultimately, it very much enhances the viewing experience. Refreshingly, the love interest, Chell, is not a bystander. When you first meet her, she has all the trappings of the damsel in distress love interest, and then immediately, all of that gets thrown out the window, and she takes control of the narrative, becoming one of the major reasons as to why the two are even able to pretend to be gods in the first place, and guiding them on their road to riches. Yeah, she still has elements of the damsel and of the femme fatale, but she still feels like a well-rounded character. And also, watching back as an adult, there are a shit ton of jokes that revolve around her character that went way over my head when I was a kid. So that just serves to enhance my enjoyment even more. And this brings us to the villain, or at least the major villain of the film, the High Priest. And I like that this guy isn't some silly cartoon villain who just wants power and glory and to rule over the kingdom himself. He's just a full-on religious fanatic who wants to serve the gods. And when they live up to that ideal, he is their greatest supporter. But when they fail to do so and expose that they're in fact liars, he turns on them instantly and tries to destroy them for their blasphemy. So yes, he is a terrible person, but he has more depth to him than simply being greedy and power hungry for the sake of being greedy and power hungry. He's a fanatic, plain and simple, and that's what drives him. And thus, he latches onto those who live up to his standards of divinity. And hell, even the more minor characters are still fun. The chief, the horse, hell, even the random civilians and children that they befriend. They might not be as well-rounded or deeply detailed, but they don't need to be. They're there to make the world feel more alive, and I think they succeed in doing that. And even beyond elements of the narrative. The soundtrack's fire, and whilst it might not be the most beautiful animation of all time, I think it still looks good. It has a fun and unique visual style, and there really isn't that much else to say. I'm not an idiot. I know this isn't the greatest film of all time. And I'm not saying it's the greatest animated film of all time. Hell, I'm not even saying it's the greatest DreamWorks film of all time. But what I am saying is that it's a genuinely good film, and that it's at least deserving of like a 75% Rotten Tomatoes score. I'm not saying it needs to be considered an all-time great. Just let it be considered decent at best. But apparently, that is in fact too much to ask, because once again, I find myself in that strange place, where it feels like I watched a completely different movie than the reviewers did all those years ago. Because we'll start with the critical reception. It has an approval rating of 48% with an average score of 5.49 out of 10. Now, I can't be bothered diving in too deep to these reviews because I'll just get heated and it'll ruin my day. So I'll just take a quick sampling. Good thing Wikipedia did that for me already. So some thoughts included: the story being too predictable, the characters too thinly developed, the story was too bombastic and not emotional enough, the soundtrack was forgettable, and the animation was bad. Okay, I can't really help but disagree with almost all of this. And hell, I'm not saying the elements are perfect, but they're definitely not as bad as they're made out to be here. I think the only major criticism I have for the film is that it is kind of racially insensitive. I mean, it's clear that this is one of those movies that thinks it was being progressive at the time. But in the end, it just turned into a story of white people saving the natives from themselves and protecting them from other nasty white invaders, which, you know, that's not a great narrative to tell. And it was rightfully called out for that shit at the time. But beyond its critical reception, it was also a commercial failure, grossing $76 million off of $95 million, cementing itself as a box office bomb. So this means that most people didn't even bother to go and see it. They weren't interested in it at the time, and there were other films they went to see instead, so it never even got a chance. And so, why did it fail? Honestly, this is just idle speculation, but I think it was yet another victim of post-Renaissance syndrome. A certain style had taken root in the minds of the public. Consumers wanted more of that. More glorious fairy tales, epic musicals. They didn't want these sort of parody slapstick films yet. It's the same problem that The Emperor's New Groove ran into. It was post-Renaissance, but pre-Shrek. So people weren't used to what it was doing just yet. So they suffered critically and commercially because of this. But in the end, I do think the creators were proved right. They were vindicated. These were good ideas. Because just like how Emperor's New Groove found a second life on home video release and quickly established itself as a cult classic, and one of Disney's most underrated films of all time, so too has El Dorado done the same through the rise of meme culture on the internet. People have found a new love and appreciation for the film. People would mine the film for excellent stills and GIFs, which would then be turned into premium memes. And since these memes were quite funny, it drew more people in as they began to realize that, oh, maybe this film was just before its time. Maybe it's just more suited to the modern audience as opposed to when it came out originally. And so now it's one of those films that, after languishing for so long in bargain bin tier, has now ascended as a cult classic and one of DreamWorks' most underrated films ever. When people talk about which films from the past didn't get the recognition they deserved, this is always on the list. Hell, a lot of the times it's at the top of the list. Like I said, I don't think many people consider this to be in contention for all-time great status, but at the same time, I do think people have come around to the idea that this film didn't get the reception it probably would have received if it had released just a couple years later. And I also think that it helps that it's just truly so memeable. It just adds a whole nother element to it in hindsight. And thus, I now feel vindicated in actually enjoying the movie. But it still does make me sad that it failed so hard at the time. I always feel bad for the makers when that kind of thing happens, but oh well, it's beloved now and that's all that matters. But with all that being said, that's the end of the video, and I would like to remind you that these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of The Road to El Dorado? Do you think it's a decent enough film? Do you think it deserved better than it received, or maybe you disagree and think it sucks and got exactly what it deserved upon its release? Maybe you think I'm completely off base. Regardless, I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.